August 15, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The heat lay over the barracks like a heavy blanket, and Carl Weber felt the cotton of his shirt stick to his back as he stepped off the truck and onto the crushed white gravel that ringed the company street. He was 26 years old, a former apprentice tailor from Bremen who had served as a signals corporal in the Africa Corps, captured near Tunis in May. The guard at the gate had checked his tag, the clerk had written his name in a ledger, and a sergeant had pointed him toward Barracks 12 where a bunk with a thin mattress and 2 brown wool blankets waited. He noticed the sound first, not the bark of orders, but a strange, busy murmur, a marketplace hum, as if the camp already had its own rhythm. Men in gray uniforms walked with bundles under their arms. 2 laughed over a newspaper in German that an American chaplain had left in the library hut. A third pushed a broom across the mess hall floor with quick, practiced strokes. Carl recognized the smell of flour and yeast from a kitchen window. He had not smelled fresh bread since Tripoli. He lowered his duffel, touched the rough wood of the barracks door, and told himself to remember what he saw. A fence of tall pine posts and 3 runs of barbed wire. A watchtower with a sun-bleached flag snapping overhead. A water tower in the distance. And beyond it, a flat Texas horizon. In his breast pocket was a folded postcard he had been given during processing in Norfolk. A card already addressed to his mother on Oosterdijk. He would write tonight. He would tell her about the strange comfort that did not feel like captivity. He did not yet know that within weeks he would be cutting cloth again, stitching collars from a forage cap, trading a pair of hand-sewn gloves for a bar of American soap, and watching as small trades multiplied until the camp around him began to behave like a small town with streets of habit, a canteen economy, and shops without signs. The same afternoon, the camp clerk explained the rules in steady, patient German. The Geneva Convention required that enlisted prisoners receive a small allowance paid as canteen credit, and that work details be voluntary except for camp maintenance. The canteen sold cigarettes, razor blades, writing paper, combs, and sometimes tins of jam when deliveries arrived from the railhead at Hearn. Red Cross parcels came in waves and carried chocolate, powdered milk, and canned meat. The parcels were distributed by roster so that each man received a fair share, but hunger and habit, memory and taste made each parcel worth more to one man than to another. Cigarettes had a value that held steady. Coffee rose and fell with rumor. Soap was gold after a hot workday in the cotton fields. A barber near the far end of the barracks row had set a chair on the porch and hung a towel from a nail. He offered haircuts for 2 cigarettes and a trim of the beard for 1. A cobbler with broad hands had already claimed a corner in the craft hut, where he turned scrap leather from old boots into belt pouches and card wallets. A former locksmith from Cologne had produced a set of tiny tools and was repairing mess tin latches for a cup of coffee each. Carl watched, listened, and felt the tug of old muscle memory in his fingers. He had learned to draft patterns as a boy, measuring sleeves and collars with twine when he could not afford a proper tape. In Barracks 12, he found men who needed shirts without frayed cuffs for Sunday service, a pair of trousers with a seam let out, a collar that did not rub raw in the August heat. He took a needle from a Red Cross sewing kit, unpicked the lining of his spare tunic, and cut straight strips from the hidden cloth. He traded his first repaired shirt for a razor and a small cake of soap. He did not write that in the postcard to his mother. He wrote about the heat, about the church choir that had visited the previous Sunday, about the library shelf that held an atlas with the pages worn thin where men traced home with their fingertips. He kept the truth of the trade in his head, a quiet ledger that began with 1 shirt, then two, then a pair of cuffs from a scavenged curtain, then a set of buttons he had carved from a scrap of pine with a mess tin spoon. Beyond the barracks street, the overview of the time was larger than any one trade, and it mattered to every man behind the wire. The summer of 1943 had brought the first big surge of prisoners to American soil after the Axis collapse in Tunisia. Between May and August, more than 100,000 German and Italian prisoners crossed the Atlantic on Liberty ships in convoys that moved like floating towns. By the end of the year, American camps would hold more than 200,000 Axis prisoners scattered across more than 100 main camps and hundreds of side camps in 40 states. Texas alone would host tens of thousands spread from the Brazos Valley to the Panhandle. The War Department paid local grocers for deliveries to canteens, hired contractors to build barracks with electric light and steam heat, and put prisoners to work in agriculture to replace farmhands pulled into the army. In the cotton belt of Texas, prisoners hoed rows under a wide sky and earned credits that padded the canteen balances that kept small economies alive. Canteen managers learned to track demand in ledgers that looked like village shop books. When a rail car arrived with 5,000 packs of cigarettes, the line formed before dawn. When a shipment included harmonicas or playing cards, the camp orchestra and the card rooms swelled with noise after evening roll call. The number of men inside the wire mattered because numbers gave momentum to trade. In a camp of 4,000, there were enough bakers to build an oven from brick and enough hands to fetch wood to feed it. There were enough barbers to keep heads neat for inspections, and enough tailors like Carl to keep cuffs straight and collars cool. The guards noticed that the barracks streets felt tidy by the third week of a new intake because services filled gaps faster when men had something to trade. The chaplain noticed that Sunday attendance rose when a violinist joined the hymns, and he found that the violin had been bought for chocolate and 2 packs of Chesterfields. The overview also included the numbers that made the camp itself a node in a larger wartime system. Rail cars brought flour by the ton, meat by the hundredweight, ice by the block, and coal for the laundry boilers. The camp laundry washed thousands of uniforms every week, and the mess halls served more than 10,000 meals every day when the camp reached its peak. The figures were prosaic, and they mattered. They were the scaffolding that allowed small trades to find a frame and turn into familiar town habits. In the quiet after lights out, Carl lay on his bunk and counted in his head. He had 2 cigarettes left that night, 3 if he finished the stub he had tucked under the edge of the slat. He had enough soap for a week if he cut the bar into 4 equal squares like he had seen the cook do. He had 1 needle, and he worried about it breaking. He thought of Bremen, of the tailor who had taught him to mend collars without leaving a ridge, of the way the shop bell had sounded in winter, when customers stamped snow from their shoes. He could not bring that street into the camp, but he could bring the feeling that work turned into trust and trust into routine. The next morning he hung a sign in the most cautious way he could manage, not a written placard, but a folded shirt pinned to the wall by the doorway with a single straight pin, cuffs even, buttons matched. Men paused, looked, and asked in low voices. He did not ask for money because there was none. He named his price in cigarettes and soap, in coffee and jam, in small canteen credits noted on a scrap of paper that he folded and kept in a tin. His ledger grew. He raised his price for a full shirt when he realized that buttons were scarce and that each button he carved cost him a blister. He lowered his price for minor repairs when he saw that a steady flow of small work kept men coming back and brought news of other needs. He listened. He learned that the orchestra needed a black cloth to drape the stage for the Sunday concert. He found 2 blankets with frayed edges in the quartermaster's shed. bartered for them with a promise to sew new patches on 3 jackets, dyed the blankets in a pot with coffee grounds until they matched, and earned enough credit to buy a handkerchief of stout cotton from the canteen. He cut that handkerchief into 2 pocket squares and sold them to guards who wanted neat collars for the Saturday dance in town. Trade crossed the fence in small ways that rules allowed. The camp commandant preferred order, and order often came from routine. A barber who set a fair price kept tempers calm. A tailor who made a guard look neat for church gave the guard one more reason to keep the barracks quiet at night. Carl did not plan any grand design. He stitched, he counted, he bartered. By the end of the month, the barracks porch held a row of men every evening, shirts draped over arms, trousers folded, talk soft and steady. The camp felt a little less like an island and a little more like a town where work had value, where a man could pay for a service and expect it to be done well, where the day had shape beyond the bugle and the roll call. The mornings began before sunrise, when the bugle sounded across the rows of barracks and the Texas light crept through cracks in the boards. Carl rose with the others, folded his blanket, and joined the line outside the mess hall. The air carried the smell of coffee and frying bacon from the American kitchen across the fence. Inside, the German cooks served oatmeal, bread, and sometimes canned meat from the Red Cross parcels. It was plain, but it was steady, and steadiness had its own comfort. After breakfast, work details were called out. Carl's name was often left off the lists, since his tailoring had become an unofficial service for both prisoners and guards. He used the mornings to take measurements, repair seams, and finish whatever orders had stacked up the night before. His hands had regained their speed, the rhythm of needle and thread moving almost automatically. A guard named Sergeant Miller had noticed his work one morning while inspecting the barracks and asked if he could fix a torn sleeve on his uniform. Carl did the repair carefully, making the stitches invisible. 2 days later, Miller brought him a pair of trousers and a small parcel of thread. "Do it like you did before," he said quietly. The favor earned Carl a new pair of scissors, American-made, stainless steel, far sharper than anything in camp. Within a week, half the guards in his sector knew the name of the tailor from Bremen. He did not boast about it. He kept to his table, his tools arranged with precision, and the quiet hum of work around him gave the camp a strange sense of industry. While Carl mended uniforms, beyond the camp fence the broader machinery of the war was shifting at immense scale. In August 1943, American factories produced more than 8,000 aircraft and nearly 50,000 trucks. Liberty ships continued to launch at a rate of 2 a day from coastal shipyards, and the total number of Axis prisoners arriving on American soil reached nearly 250,000. Camps like Herne had become logistical microcosms of a wartime nation that seemed to know no limits to production. Each camp had its own power plant, bakery, laundry, hospital, and postal office. At Herne, records show that over 4,000 letters left the camp every week, each one bearing the same printed line: Service des prisonniers de guerre. The prisoners sent money orders home, small sums saved from work wages that the U.S. government recorded in Geneva reports. In the fields beyond Herne, prisoner labor harvested cotton, onions, and wheat worth millions of dollars to the American economy by the end of 1944. Yet behind the statistics, human systems evolved. In every camp, informal markets like Carl's tailoring trade began to appear. Some men offered carpentry, others drew portraits of guards' families from photographs, and one former pastry chef from Frankfurt baked small cakes in improvised ovens for trade. American officers tolerated it because order grew from activity. When men worked, they argued less. When they could trade, they stole less. The camp's commandant called it self-regulating morale, a phrase that would appear later in an army report praising Hearn as one of the best-run installations in the region. By October, Carl's small corner of Barracks 12 had transformed. He had a table built from salvaged boards, a shelf for folded fabric, and a tin sign etched with his initials. Men brought him everything from tunics to curtains, and in return, he traded for what he needed: thread, food, cigarettes, even scraps of paper. He began keeping notes on each exchange, not for greed, but to maintain fairness. Cigarettes had become the universal currency of camp life. A haircut cost $2. A letter written in careful script for an illiterate man cost $1, and Carl's repairs ranged from 3 to 10 depending on the work. When the Red Cross shipments delayed that autumn, prices rose sharply. A single bar of soap fetched 5 cigarettes. Coffee tripled in value. Carl saw how easily scarcity ruled men's tempers. Fights broke out near the canteen, and once 2 prisoners came to blows over a pair of American shoes found near the laundry. Carl refused to take part in such trades. "Everything must be worth the same tomorrow as today," he told a fellow tailor. His quiet insistence earned him a reputation for honesty that drew both respect and reliance. Even the guards came to him when a button needed replacing. Once, when the camp generator failed, Carl stitched together a leather belt to repair the pulley on a washing machine. It worked, and the American mechanic gave him a spare pair of gloves in thanks. Little by little, his work connected men who would never have spoken otherwise. Farmhands from Bavaria, sailors from Hamburg, and students from Berlin, all bound by the rhythm of labor and exchange. The wider world beyond the wire grew darker as winter approached. In Europe, Allied bombers struck Hamburg and Berlin with devastating force. News filtered into the camp through new arrivals and occasional American newspapers. Carl read the headlines cautiously, tracing the printed lines about cities he knew. "Bremen heavily bombed," one report said. He folded the page quietly and stared out the window of his barracks. The camp loudspeakers played American music in the evenings, Glenn Miller's orchestra drifting faintly over the wire. In that sound, he felt both distance and safety. He had begun to dream not of victory or escape, but of work, steady, ordinary work. The camp's economy, once improvised, had taken on the habits of a small town. There was a barber, a shoemaker, a letter writer, a baker, and now a tailor with steady orders. The Red Cross inspectors who visited in December noted that Camp Hearn's prisoners displayed remarkable industry and orderliness, and that a certain internal commerce has developed under appropriate supervision. Carl's ledger that winter listed more than 60 transactions. Each line was a thread in a fabric larger than any one man. The camp had become, by quiet degrees, a living economy, built not by command, but by necessity and by the human instinct to create normal life wherever confinement tried to erase it. By early 1944, the rhythm of life at Camp Hearn had settled into a steady hum that blurred the line between captivity and routine. The guards still counted every head at dawn and dusk, but the men moved through the day with practiced purpose. Carl's workshop had grown so popular that the camp administration designated one corner of the recreation hall as an official tailoring room. He was given a workbench, a set of shelves, and a roll of canvas intended for tent repair that he quietly diverted into practical garments. Every few days, an American sergeant brought in uniforms needing alteration. In return, Carl received spools of thread, patches of khaki, or the occasional can of condensed milk. He shared these goods carefully, keeping a ledger so no man felt cheated. Beneath the surface of this small trade was a simple truth. Barter had become the camp's bloodstream. When a shipment of Red Cross parcels arrived, the energy across the barracks surged. Men opened the boxes like treasure chests, sorting cigarettes, coffee, canned beef, and chocolate into piles. The canteen issued ration tokens, but the real market took place in whispered exchanges. A can of corned beef fetched up to 20 cigarettes. Soap could buy a service. A single piece of chocolate could be split into trades that carried through a dozen hands. Carl's tailoring work had become so reliable that other prisoners came to him not just for clothing, but to settle disputes about value. He had become, in effect, the camp's merchant of trust. The war beyond the fences raged on. January 1944 saw Allied bombers striking German industrial cities with relentless force. In Italy, the Battle of Monte Cassino ground through winter mud. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies surged westward through Ukraine. Yet within the barbed wire world of Camp Hearn, life moved according to a separate calendar. Prisoners kept careful note of the seasons through the arrival of work crews, the ripening of crops in nearby fields, and the tone of the American Guard's news bulletins. They noticed that guards grew tense when the news from Europe was good for the Allies. In March, one bulletin announced the liberation of Kiev. A prisoner in Barracks 8 shouted that the report was false and was silenced by his comrades. The next week, an American chaplain confirmed that it was true. The same month, new prisoners arrived from North Africa and Italy, thinner and more subdued than those captured in 1943. Carl watched them during roll call, recognizing the look of men who had seen too much. He offered them work, small repairs on their torn clothing, a patch for a sleeve, a fixed seam on a cap. He did not charge them at first. They had nothing to trade, and kindness, he had learned, bought more stability than profit. Soon they found ways to repay him: a carved pipe, a tin cup polished bright, a few cigarettes shared at dusk. Each exchange restored a little order to their lives, and by the end of spring, the camp's internal trade system functioned with remarkable efficiency. Prisoners calculated values, kept ledgers, and even enforced fairness through peer pressure. It resembled, in every sense except freedom, a small, self-sustaining town. When the cotton season began that summer, hundreds of prisoners were assigned to work crews that left camp each morning under light guard. Carl stayed behind, tending his trade and keeping watch over the barracks economy. He noticed that money flowed back each evening from those work crews. The men returned with canteen credits earned from farm labor, 15 cents a day according to the Geneva Convention. They spent it quickly on cigarettes and sweets. Some asked Carl to mend the clothes they had torn in the fields. He expanded his workshop, employing 2 assistants who had worked as tailors in Leipzig and Munich. They stitched while he handled customers, keeping careful records in a notebook bound from scrap paper. "It is better than a camp," one of his helpers said. "It is a small town, only fenced." He was right. The barracks had become neighborhoods. Men greeted each other by occupation: barber, cook, tailor, shoemaker, and even organized small markets on Sunday afternoons. The guards tolerated it as long as it stayed peaceful. One American lieutenant wrote in his report that the prisoners show more initiative in building community than many free citizens. He might have been half joking, but he was not wrong. The camp's transformation mirrored a phenomenon seen across America's prisoner network. Wherever thousands of men gathered with time and rationed resources, order emerged through trade. Psychologists later described it as spontaneous social equilibrium. But for Carl and his comrades, it was simpler. It was survival with dignity. That summer was also when the outside world intruded most sharply. On June 6, 1944, the Guards announced that Allied forces had landed in Normandy. The news reached the camp by radio, and a strange silence followed. For the older soldiers, it confirmed what they already feared. For the younger ones, it meant that the war might finally end. Carl sat on his bunk that night reading an old letter from home. It had arrived months late, the paper brittle from travel. His mother wrote that the tailor shop in Bremen had been damaged in an air raid, but that she was alive. He folded the letter slowly, thinking of the camp as a mirror image of the world beyond, the same species of human effort, but directed toward order instead of destruction. That night, the camp lights flickered against the dark horizon, and the sound of a harmonica drifted across the yard. The guard in Tower 2 leaned on his rail and listened. Below him, 1,000 men slept in wooden huts that had, against all intention, become homes. The fences still stood, the guards still watched, and the war still raged. But inside the wire, one man's quiet trade had helped turn confinement into community, and survival into a semblance of civilization. Autumn 1944 arrived in Texas, with long golden days and cooler nights, and the camp's hum of industry grew stronger, as if the air itself urged men to keep working. Carl woke earlier now, often before the bugle, sitting by the small window of his workshop as dawn spread over the cotton fields. He had grown lean but steady, his hands calloused and sure. His ledger filled with neat handwriting, lines of trades and dates. 2 shirts repaired, 3 cigarettes paid, 1 new collar for Sergeant Miller, 1 spool of thread received. He had become more than a tailor. He was part of the structure that kept 4,000 men balanced between discipline and despair. His assistants, Otto and Franz, worked beside him, their benches lit by electric bulbs powered from the camp generator. Outside, the morning roll call echoed in both German and English. The camp orchestra sometimes played a march to lighten the mood, and afterward the men dispersed, some to kitchen duty, others to field work or classes. Carl's bench, however, never stayed empty for long. Men queued with uniforms, blankets, even bits of cloth they hoped to turn into shirts. He noticed something new in their tone, not the desperation of prisoners, but the quiet pride of craftsmen. "You make the seams so straight," one said. "It reminds me of home." Carl nodded and said little. He had learned that silence was a kind of currency, too. By then, Camp Hearn had evolved into one of the most complex prisoner communities in America. The official camp newspaper, Der Ruf, circulated weekly, written and edited by prisoners under supervision. It printed poetry, chess problems, and even serialized novels. The educational programs had expanded into over 60 classes: English lessons, mathematics, agriculture, and history. At night, lights from the recreation hall glowed across the yard, where the orchestra practiced Beethoven and Brahms. The U.S. Army reports from that year listed more than 70 trades active inside the camp: blacksmiths, tailors, carpenters, barbers, shoemakers, and painters. The internal economy had grown so sophisticated that each barracks used small chits of paper to track credit. Cigarettes remained the standard, but the system itself had acquired a rhythm similar to a civilian marketplace. Carl had unintentionally become one of its key figures. His shop provided uniforms for theater performances, altar cloths for church services, and repairs for guards' clothing. American officers often remarked on the camp's efficiency. "They run it like a town council," one lieutenant noted in a 1944 inspection report. He was not far from the truth. The German senior NCOs met weekly with U.S. staff to discuss labor, discipline, and supplies. The result was a community that functioned with remarkable order, built on mutual interest rather than trust alone. Beyond the wire, the world was collapsing for Germany. By September 1944, the Allies had liberated Paris, and American forces were pushing toward the Siegfried Line. In the east, the Red Army stood on the Vistula River. The radio reports reached the prisoners with cold clarity. Some men cheered quietly. Others turned away in silence. Karl listened, but kept his focus on work. He could not control the war, but he could mend what was torn in front of him. Still, he felt the tension rise. The number of Red Cross parcels had decreased as shipping lines grew strained. Coffee vanished from the canteen for weeks. Sugar became rare. Tempers flared more easily. Yet even scarcity became fuel for ingenuity. Men began to repurpose materials, thread unraveled from socks, buttons carved from wood or bone. Karl learned to boil old fabric to loosen the fibers and weave them again. "In war, nothing is waste," he told his apprentice. The guards noticed the calm in his section. When fights broke out in other barracks, Barracks 12 remained orderly. The commandant once said to him during inspection, "You run a better shop than some towns I've seen." Karl smiled faintly, unsure whether it was praise or irony. He only knew that his small world held steady while everything beyond it seemed to burn. As the year ended, rumors of the war's approaching conclusion spread through the camp. Some prisoners began to dream of home. Others feared what home had become. Letters told of cities flattened, families displaced, and industries ruined. The men spoke less of victory and more of survival. Karl's work continued until his hands stiffened from winter cold. On Christmas Eve, the camp chapel was filled with both prisoners and guards. The choir sang Stille Nacht in German, and the American chaplain answered with Silent Night. The camp mess served a feast of turkey, potatoes, and pie, and every man received a package prepared by local families. Karl's contained socks, soap, and a small note that read, "From the people of Hearne, Texas. Peace will come soon." That night he returned to his barracks and added one last entry to his ledger. December 24th, 1944. All debts cleared. All trades closed for the year. He closed the book and set it beside his bunk. Outside, the Texas wind rustled the pine trees that ringed the camp. The war was still raging across oceans and continents, but inside the wire of Camp Hearne, a tailor's small trade had built an economy that felt, at least for a moment, like peace itself. The first days of 1945 brought a restless stillness to Camp Hearne. The guards spoke less often about the war, and when they did, their voices carried the tone of inevitability rather than victory. Karl felt it too. The work continued, but the sense of purpose that had once filled his hands now turned inward. He kept mending shirts and patching trousers, though fewer men needed his services. Most had all they required by now. His assistants spent the quieter hours helping the chaplain sew banners for the Sunday service. Yet despite the calm, tension drifted like smoke through the camp. New prisoners arrived from the Battle of the Bulge, exhausted, bitter, and wary. They told stories of frozen forests, destroyed villages, and soldiers fighting without hope. Karl listened as he stitched a tear in one man's coat. "The Ardennes was madness," the soldier said. "We were promised victory, but it was suicide." That night, Carl wrote in his diary that the last faith in the old order had frozen and broken. He sensed that his country was dying not only on the battlefield, but in the minds of its sons. Beyond the fences, American industry surged toward its peak. In January 1945, factories produced nearly 100,000 trucks and armored vehicles in a single month. Steel output exceeded 80 million tons for the year, and aircraft production reached levels unmatched in history. At the same time, the American public began to feel the fatigue of victory. Newspapers spoke of rationing, war bonds, and the hope of peace. The War Department accelerated preparations for repatriation, planning the return of prisoners once hostilities ceased. Camp Hearn, with its record of order and productivity, was cited as a model for post-war transition. Its prisoners had contributed more than 200,000 hours of labor to Texas farms, generating millions of dollars in agricultural output. The commandant, Colonel Clifford Cox, was quoted in a 1945 Army report as saying, "They came as soldiers, but they worked as men who understood discipline." Yet inside the wire, what had begun as discipline had evolved into something subtler. It was cooperation born from routine, trust built from small exchanges, and dignity sustained by shared labor. Carl's tailoring business had reached its quiet zenith. His ledger now contained over 200 entries, a testament to 18 months of steady trade. He had repaired American uniforms, crafted altar cloths, and even sewn doll clothes for a guard's daughter, a gift that earned him a rare smile. The camp's internal economy continued to function smoothly. Cigarettes remained currency, but barter had expanded into services, entertainment, and even education. Violin lesson from one of the orchestra players was worth 3 cigarettes. A handwritten poem for a loved one cost 1. Carl often received these small tokens as payment, tucking them between the pages of his notebook. He had become, without intention, the camp's quiet chronicler. The men confided in him because his work required silence. He heard of homes destroyed, wives lost, and children growing up without fathers. He listened but did not judge. His own thoughts were divided between duty and longing. Each evening, he walked to the edge of the wire and watched the headlights of trucks on the highway beyond. They moved freely toward destinations he could only imagine. He wondered whether Bremen still had streets lit at night, or if the city was now only rubble and silence. The news of April came like a storm. On the 12th, word spread through the camp that President Franklin Roosevelt had died. The guards wore black armbands, and the prisoners stood in respectful silence during the announcement. Carl noticed that even the most hardened men bowed their heads. 3 weeks later, the radio crackled again with the words they had all waited to hear. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Men shouted, laughed, and wept, though few understood what peace would mean. The camp loudspeakers played both national anthems, the American and the Old German, and for the first time in 2 years, the sound of freedom seemed close enough to touch. That night, the prisoners were allowed to gather outside under the Texas sky. The guards did not stop them. Carl looked around at the faces lit by the floodlights and realized that their world had changed forever. He would soon go home, but home was now an idea, not a place. Behind him, the workshop stood empty, his tools neatly packed away. The camp that had once been a symbol of defeat had become, through habit and labor, a town that would vanish as quietly as it had formed. As the men drifted back to their barracks, Carl lingered by the wire, feeling the night breeze against his face. The fences no longer felt like prison walls. They felt like the borders of a chapter ending. The summer of 1945 unfolded with the sound of trains. Across the American heartland, prisoner camps began the slow process of emptying as thousands of Germans were prepared for repatriation. At Camp Hearn, the notice came on a morning of sharp sunlight and dust. Karl stood in formation as an officer read out the list of names. His was not among them. The first transports were reserved for the sick, the wounded, and those captured earliest. He returned to his bench afterward, silently setting his needle and scissors back in place. He had expected this. Bureaucracy moved slower than hope. Still, the camp had changed again. The once bustling markets grew quieter as men departed. Barracks emptied. Workshops closed. The barber chairs stood vacant. Karl kept working for those who remained, finishing his last few commissions with the care of habit. His shop, once a place of barter and chatter, now echoed with the hollow stillness of departure. Yet he refused to let idleness take root. He repaired bed linens for the hospital and helped patch the uniforms of guards preparing to transfer. When an American officer thanked him for his diligence, Karl only nodded and said, "It passes the time." The wider world had entered a new and uncertain peace. In Europe, millions wandered among ruins. Germany lay divided between occupation zones. Factories stood silent, cities gutted, railways torn. In America, victory parades rolled through city streets. But in the camps scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska, a quieter reckoning took place. Men who had once believed in conquest now studied democracy in classrooms built from barracks. Lectures on the U.S. Constitution, economics, and agriculture filled the schedules that had once been dominated by drills. The same Army psychologists who had monitored prisoner morale now spoke of re-education and reconstruction. At Hearn, a notice posted near the canteen announced new courses taught by visiting instructors from the University of Texas. Karl attended one out of curiosity. The professor, a soft-spoken man with wire-rimmed glasses, spoke about small-town governance and local economies. "A community survives not through control," he said, "but through cooperation." The words struck Karl deeply. He thought of his workshop, the barter ledgers, and the network of trades that had kept the camp balanced through scarcity. Without knowing it, they had lived that principle daily. By late August, the Red Cross trucks rolled in again, bringing parcels marked for those awaiting transport. The men gathered near the fence to watch as crates were unloaded, their white emblems bright against the dust. Karl received his final parcel: biscuits, coffee, writing paper, and a tin of condensed milk. He divided it among his assistants before they left on separate trains. "We will meet again," Franz said, though both knew the odds were small. As the evenings grew cooler, the camp's electric lights flickered over empty spaces where markets once buzzed. The orchestra had disbanded, the newspaper ceased printing, and the small theater stood dark. Karl spent his nights reading old letters and keeping his tools sharp. On September 2nd, 1945, when news reached the camp that Japan had surrendered, ending the war completely, the guards opened the gates for a brief ceremony. Both sides stood together in silence as the American flag rose in the morning light. The prisoners sang softly in German, not as soldiers but as men marking the close of an era. Karl felt the weight of 6 years lift, replaced by the fragile uncertainty of what came next. His repatriation notice finally came in October. He packed his few belongings, a notebook filled with trade records, a letter from his mother, a spool of American thread, and a small pair of scissors. The train, Journey back to the East Coast took 4 days. Through the windows, he watched the vast sweep of the American landscape, endless fields, factories, and towns stitched together by highways and power lines. It was the same world that had first shattered his beliefs 2 years earlier, now seen not with awe, but with quiet understanding. At Norfolk, Virginia, he boarded a ship bound for Le Havre, joining thousands of other men returning to a country they no longer recognized. As the ship pulled away, Carl leaned on the rail, feeling the sea wind against his face. Behind him lay a camp that had begun as a cage and ended as a community. Ahead lay the task of rebuilding from ashes. He did not know if his old shop in Bremen still stood, or if his mother yet lived in the same street. But he carried something stronger than certainty, knowledge that work, fairness, sincere, and dignity would rebuild more than walls. They could rebuild men. The ship reached Le Havre under gray skies and cold wind. Carl stepped onto French soil with a small canvas bag over his shoulder, carrying everything he owned. The port still bore the scars of bombardment. Twisted cranes, sunken hulls, warehouses ripped open like old wounds. Yet among the ruins moved a steady rhythm of rebuilding. American and British trucks lined the docks, unloading crates marked UNRWA for relief distribution. Prisoners were processed in long queues, each man questioned, documented, and sorted by region of origin. Carl waited 6 hours before an officer stamped his repatriation papers. His destination, Bremen. The journey home by rail took 3 days through landscapes of desolation. Entire towns lay flattened, church spires split in half, bridges collapsed into rivers. In every station, crowds of refugees huddled with bundles of clothing and small children. The once proud trains of the Reich now crawled along patched tracks, their cars marked with chalked numbers instead of destinations. As Carl looked out at the wreckage, he realized that nothing remained of the Germany he had known. The nation that had once believed in superiority had been stripped to hunger and rubble. Yet amid the ruins, he felt a strange calm. The war had burned away illusions. What remained was a blank page. When he reached Bremen, it was no longer a city, but a skeleton. Roofs were gone, windows shattered, streets buried beneath brick and ash. He found the site of his family's tailor shop on Böttcherstrasse reduced to a blackened foundation. A neighbor recognized him and told him that his mother had survived the air raids but died of illness the previous winter. Carl listened in silence, thanked the man, and walked away. That evening he sat on a pile of bricks where his shop had stood and opened his old notebook. Inside were the ledgers from the camp, names, trades, payments in cigarettes, and short notes beside some entries. Good man, honest. Lost home in Hamburg. Owes 2 stitches. The handwriting of his past. Life stared back at him like an account book of humanity. He turned to the back page and wrote a single line. Begin again. The next morning, he went to the ruins of the old city hall where British occupation authorities had posted notices for reconstruction work. He signed up to repair uniforms for labor crews and volunteers. They paid in food vouchers, and he accepted without hesitation. For the first time in years, he was working not because he must, but because work itself gave shape to time. The months that followed were slow but steady. Carl found other tailors among the displaced, and together they set up a small workshop in a half-collapsed warehouse. They used fabric salvaged from military stores and machines scavenged from the ruins. Within weeks, they were repairing civilian clothes for hundreds of people. Cigarettes again became currency, then paper money, then ration tokens. The rhythm felt familiar. Sometimes when he handed a mended coat back to a customer, he thought of Camp Hearn, the tables lined with thread, the barter markets, the laughter that had softened captivity. He told no one about it, but the memory guided him. As new democratic councils formed under Allied supervision, Bremen's citizens began electing local representatives, rebuilding their city one brick at a time. In 1947, Karl's shop reopened officially under the name Werkstatt für Schneiderhandwerk Burkhardt. Its sign was modest, painted on reclaimed wood. But inside the shelves were full, the lights electric, and the air smelled of soap and fabric dye. In the years that followed, Karl married a widow named Marta, who had lost her husband at Stalingrad. Together they rebuilt not only a business, but a way of life grounded in fairness and steady labor. When the Marshall Plan arrived, shipments of American cotton and tools reached Bremen's docks. Karl recognized the labels, companies from Texas and Ohio, names he had seen stamped on crates in the camp warehouses. He told Marta, "These are from where I learned how to live again." She did not understand fully, but she saw how carefully he handled each spool of thread, as if it were a relic. By 1952, his shop employed 6 apprentices, many of them young men who had never known peace until then. He taught them not only sewing, but order, honesty, and the quiet value of work. "A man's worth," he said, "is not measured by what he owns, but by what he repairs." When journalists later asked how he had survived the war, he answered simply, "By keeping my hands busy." Karl Burkhardt died in 1978 at the age of 65. His shop still stood on the same rebuilt street, its sign unchanged. In the attic, his family found a box containing his camp ledger, scissors, and a photograph of Camp Hearn's barracks taken by an American guard in 1944. The ledger's final entry, written in faded ink, read, "Freedom is work done with dignity." Historians who later studied Camp Hearn would describe it as one of the POW, most successful prisoner communities in wartime America, a place where men stripped of liberty had recreated society through labor and trade. For Karl, it had been more personal. Within fences meant to confine him, he had rediscovered humanity. His secret trade had not only turned a camp into a small town, it had turned captivity into a classroom for democracy. Through needle, thread, and fairness, he had stitched together the first small fabric of a new Germany, one built not on conquest, but on creation. And when the lights of Bremen shone again after the long darkness, they reflected the same lesson he had learned under the Texas sun: that the surest path to rebuilding a broken world begins with the simple act of honest work.